Let's talk about history and fate. This is something that is I get this question a lot, right? Do you think that we're fated to go down a certain path, or do you think that individuals can make a difference? One person can stand up and make a difference. And that's one of the oldest questions in literature, the oldest questions in political philosophy. Sometimes you talk about the great man theory of history. Someday when we talk about War and Peace, we will talk about the question of Napoleon, whether Napoleon was just, kind of a sign of the times, or whether he changed the course of history, all of this stuff. And it's particularly important in big moments of crisis like ours, right? To wonder whether things are just fated to roll along as the cycle of regimes carries forth, or whether individuals can change things and make a difference. Obviously, I do believe that even though certain historical trends indicate that certain things will go a certain way, you nevertheless have the ability to affect things around you. And this is the question that I think is playing a lot in the mind of William Shakespeare, a person whom we talk about a lot on this show, in his history play, King John. Now, we've talked about one Shakespeare tragedy. We talked about Macbeth. We talked about one Shakespeare comedy when we talked about Twelfth Night. And now I want to look at the history plays. And these are typically understood as the plays that deal with the history of England, because many plays like Julius Caesar, for example, deal with historical events, but they are nevertheless, further fetched and sometimes get classed instead as tragedies and things like that. So I'm going to talk about when I group these, and I'm going to cycle through as we do each of these plays, right? I'm going to talk about the history plays as the plays about the kings of England, and I'm going to go through them in chronological order, not in terms of when they were written, but in terms of the events that they describe, so that at the same time as we talk about Shakespeare's history plays, we can talk about the history of England, because England has, I believe, one of the most amazing histories. And I should really say Britain, which describes the whole island, including Scotland, and not just England, which is, in some ways, it's almost politically incorrect in England to restrict things to England, because that describes a kind of historical racial designation of the control that the Angles and the Saxons exerted over parts of this island. That's going further back in history maybe than I need to go just at this moment, because King John comes along at the turn of the 13th century. So we're looking here sort of 1199 up to 1216. And this is after what's called the Norman Conquest. So we've had basically a battle, the Battle of Hastings, between the Anglo-Saxon kings and William the Conqueror, or William the Duke of Normandy. And that ends you up in this situation where people who are dukes in France are kings in England. And so they're subject to the rule of the King of France in France, but they're also ruling in England. And this, obviously there are a number of dynastic complications along the way. But King John comes basically near the end of this period of time when England and France are actually not so totally separate from one another. And he's part of a dynasty called the Angevin dynasty, named after Anjou, which is where their power in France was concentrated. If you want to get really deep into the texts and the works that we talk about on this show, I really do recommend learning ancient Greek or Latin with the Ancient Language Institute. They're gearing up right now for their fall semester, so there's a new opportunity to sign up. And it's an exciting semester because they're adding on a language, Biblical Hebrew. That's obviously the language of the Old Testament. And I can't describe to you what it was like for me to learn Biblical Hebrew in grad school. It just opened my mind to an entirely new world of thought and way of thinking about God. It's such a profound way to deepen your faith, or just to deepen your literary engagement with these texts. They're great at teaching these languages at the Ancient Language Institute. They teach them like living languages. And you can sign up now by going to ancientlanguage.com/heretics. And when you use the code heretics, HERETICS, you get 15% off. So check out the fall semester. Don't be worried if you've never heard a single word of Latin. They take students of all ages and experience levels, even if you're a total beginner or you're very advanced. So reach out and check out their Latin, Greek, and Hebrew courses at ancientlanguage.com/heretics. 15% off with the offer code heretics. Just like in the title, because they are heretics like us, but not from God. Okay. We have talked about King John before on this show, and we talked about him with Senator Ted Cruz because in 1215, right, there was this momentous event, and that was the Magna Carta. And that basically kind of, when we look back at Magna Carta, we think about the beginning of the written constitution. And that's, Britain famously does not have an actual written constitution, but this is binding the king because he had so terribly abused the barons, that is the noblemen under his control, right? He had to be bound to God, and God was going to be the kind of absolute morality as mediated by Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, over these disputing powers, the elites, the barons, and the king. We are talking now about a period quite a bit earlier than that, which is part of why the barons were so mad at him, and that is that he basically lost France. And that's part of why this kind of brings to an end the period when Britain is also ruling over a serious portion in the north of France. And so what's interesting about the Shakespeare play, but also about the history behind it, right, is it's kind of like a story of bumbling ineptitude and chance that leads to this momentous shift in English history and politics, where they no longer have control over these territories in France. John is one of the most maligned, maybe the most maligned king in the history of England. No king was ever named John after him. And so Shakespeare has that context in the back of his mind as he's writing, but he's not writing, well, he's writing about this great military catastrophe, but he does not deal with Magna Carta or the stuff that we've talked about. He's much more concerned with this idea of dynastic succession, right? And with the struggle, the squabble that emerges over who has the right to rule. And so in order to get into that, I'm going to bring in also not just Shakespeare's play, but Holinshed's Chronicles, which I've mentioned before as a major source for Shakespeare. This is a big collection. It's not written actually by just Raphael Holinshed, who's the person whose name is attached to it. It's actually a compilation of a bunch of sources, a bunch of chroniclers. It gives you this continuous history of England. And so it's a major resource for Shakespeare. And it contains all of these different kind of reports and discussions of some of the stuff that ends up, you can see how it comes into Shakespeare's tragedy. This is a play which is probably, well, it's often dated to around 1596. And the reason for that is that it has these amazing, heartbreaking depictions of paternal grief, motherly grief. A mother who loses her son and grieves beautifully. And Shakespeare's own son, Hamnet, died in 1596. And so it's sometimes thought that perhaps this is a reflection. And that's when the play is dated to, but that's far from certain. Nevertheless, we're certainly centuries on from the events that are being described. And the whole thing kind of comes about because of a squabble over succession, as I said. And this is also how the reign of King John is really introduced in Holinshed's Chronicles. So you have King John, and then you also have his nephew, Arthur. And Arthur is basically being claimed, he's very young at this time, but he's basically being claimed as the rightful king of these French territories, of Angiers and Anjou and all of these places. So Thomas, this is from Holinshed, right? Thomas de Furness, nephew to the said Robert de Turnham, delivered the city and castle of Angiers unto Arthur, Duke of Britain. For by general consent of the nobles of the counties of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, Arthur was received as the liege and sovereign lord of the same countries. For even at this present, and so soon as it was known that King Richard was deceased, diverse cities and towns on that side of the sea, belonging to the said Richard whilst he lived, fell at odds amongst themselves, some of them endeavouring to prefer King John, other labouring to be under the governance of Arthur, Duke of Britain, considering he seemed by most right to be the chief lord, for so much as he was son to Geoffrey, elder brother to John. So Arthur is John's nephew. They are competing for inheritance of the reign of Richard Lionheart, Richard I, Richard Plantagenet, who has died. And so there's basically this squabble over who is going to be able to exert power. The French cities want Arthur, potentially because they can manipulate him better. They have a more direct connection to him. But this is going to erupt basically into a war. So while King John was thus occupied in recovering his brother's treasure and traveling with his subjects to reduce them to his obedience, Queen Eleanor, his mother, by the help of Hubert, Archbishop of Canterbury, and other of the noblemen and barons of the land, traveled as diligently to procure the English people to receive their oath of allegiance to be true to King John. Now, Eleanor is the first of two remarkable mothers in the play King John, but also in the story of John. So there's John's mother Eleanor, who's basically on his side as he strives, essentially Queen Eleanor, as he strives to gain the allegiance of as many of these nobles as he can, because this is a time when inheritance is uncertain, and your the support of the nobles is part of what makes you a king, essentially, even though, of course, there are formal coronation ceremonies and all that. So let's get into this and how this conflict is introduced in Act 1, Scene 1 of Shakespeare's play. And this is the Chatillon of France comes on to deliver the king's demands. Let me tell you a little bit about Public Goods. I love this place. It's an online store where you can get all your basics, and you know that they're free of all the dumb like preservatives and additives and weird stuff that you sometimes get in the grocery store. You guys know that I'm a big fitness nut. I really care about health and fitness. This is a big part of that, having food and products and brands that you can trust to be clean and healthy. So they have a bunch of stuff, not just food. I love their ramen and their almonds, but I also really like they have this dish soap that looks beautiful in my kitchen. The packaging is clean. It's all free of all those harmful additives and stuff that we're reading about now all the time in the news. I worked out a great deal just for Young Heretics listeners. You can get $15 off of your first Public Goods order with no minimum purchase. So you don't have to buy any particular amount of stuff. You just get 15 bucks off when you go to publicgoods.com/heretics or use code heretics at checkout. So that's publicgoods.com/heretics to get $15 off your first order. Clean, eco-friendly essentials, soap, toilet paper, cat food, human food. It's all great. It's all there. publicgoods.com/heretics. Okay. So I'm using my Folger Shakespeare Library editions from the very first Shakespeare episode. I have been blessed with this complete Folger Shakespeare Library. They're beautiful. They have notes on the other side of the page, and I really love using them. So I would recommend this one if you are looking for a good edition of King John. So Chatillon says, Philip of France, in right and true behalf of thy deceased brother Geoffrey's son, Arthur Plantagenet, lays most lawful claim to this fair island and the territories, to Ireland, Poitiers, Anjou, Touraine, Maine, desiring thee to lay aside the sword which sways usurpingly these several titles, and put the same into young Arthur's hand, thy nephew and right royal sovereign. So you can already see that list, right, of where they lay claim to for Arthur is kind of lifted out of Holinshed, but put into this iambic pentameter, right? So Ireland, Poitiers, Anjou, Touraine, Maine. King John, what follows if we disallow of this? Chatillon, the proud control of fierce and bloody war, to enforce these rights so forcibly withheld. King John, here have we war for war and blood for blood, controlment for controlment, so answer France. Chatillon, then take my king's defiance from my mouth, the farthest limit of my embassy. King John, bear mine to him, and so depart in peace. Be thou as lightning in the eyes of France, for ere thou canst report, I will be there. The thunder of my cannon shall be heard. So hence, be thou the trumpet of our wrath, and sullen presage of your own decay. An honourable conduct let him have. Pembroke, look to it. Farewell, Chatillon. Probably pronounced Chatillon because the English love to pronounce things in their own English pronunciation, and to scan you make it Chatillon, but Chatillon is how you would pronounce it in French. Here's Queen Eleanor, right? What now, my son? Have I not ever said how that ambitious Constance would not cease till she had kindled France and all the world upon the right and party of her son? This might have been prevented and made whole with very easy arguments of love, which now the manage of two kingdoms must with fearful bloody issue arbitrate. So here's the other mother, that ambitious Constance, the mother of Arthur. So you have Eleanor, mother of John, Constance, mother of Arthur, and these two kings being basically clashed against each other by the forces of history, by the King of France, Philip, and the mothers who want them in power, and of course John himself, who is represented as a spirited king in his own right. None of this is drawn out of thin air. There is an amazing set of passages in Holinshed about Eleanor and Constance, and so it seems as if this is rooted somewhere in truth, right? So remember that Eleanor in Holinshed was reported to have been shoring up allegiance on behalf of John, as John himself is also doing for himself when he comes into the inheritance of the crown. Here's Holinshed again, right? Surely Queen Eleanor, the king's mother, was sore against her nephew Arthur, rather moved there by envy conceived against his mother than upon any just occasion given in the behalf of the child, for that she saw, if he were king, how his mother Constance would look to bear most rule within the realm of England, till her son should come to lawful age to govern of himself. So they're saying basically that Eleanor is afraid that Constance wants to rule in Arthur's stead because Arthur is too young. And so this assertion of rule over France is not just rule over France, it's the whole shebang, right? It's this whole Angevin dynasty is thought to belong to Arthur, or claimed to belong to Arthur by, among other people, the King of France. So remember that France is its own kingdom, and the Dukes of Normandy are also kings of England. So they're under the power of the king in France, but they are kings in England. So it's very complicated, but King Philip wants somebody that he can control so that he can exert his power over this Angevin territory. When this doing of the queen was signified unto the said Constance, she, doubting the surety of her son, committed him to the trust of the French king, who, receiving him into his tuition, promised to defend him from all his enemies, and forthwith furnished the holds in Britain with French soldiers. Queen Eleanor being advertised hereof, Queen Eleanor passed into Normandy, stood in doubt by and by of her country, of Guienne, and therefore with all possible speed passed over the sea and came to her son John into Normandy, and shortly after they went forth together into the country of Maine, and there took both the city and castle of Manus, throwing down the walls and turrets thereof, with all the fortifications and stone houses in and about the same, and kept the citizens as prisoners. So now Eleanor and John are making their move. They want to be in charge, obviously. They want to remain in charge of Normandy and Anjou. So if you look at the map of France, right, Normandy is the northernmost part that's close to England, and that's where the Normans came from France to conquer England, and this Angevin dynasty is also in control of Anjou, which is to the south and sort of in the middle. But again, still under the King of France insofar as they are in France. Very complicated, but still comprehensible. Now, it's the House of Capet that is ruling France, or Capet, under Philip II. And this is an object of concern for him, because at this time, remember, all monarchs are shoring up their power, and nation states are not really a thing yet, right? It's kings that are barely more than warlords exerting control over tribal allegiances. France itself is less large in territory than we now think of it as, or extends less far to the east, let's say, than it now does. And you're dealing with these two rival powers struggling for control, basically, of this joint monarchy. And so much of Shakespeare's play kind of compresses this conflict and brings them, King Philip and King John, to a head outside the besieged city of Angiers. And we need also to be aware of one other person who is involved in all of this, and that's Philip Falconbridge, or the bastard. And Philip is a bastard son of Richard Lionheart, which raises this whole series of questions, right? Again, about inheritance, right? This is kind of a muddled, mixed up world where, you know, instead of this sort of divine passage of the crown from one head to another, you have these chances, these accidents, and everything kind of tumbling out as we learn in the first scene, really, that Philip Falconbridge is actually Philip the Bastard, and he gets called Philip Plantagenet because he's sort of given this recognition as distant part of the royal family, but he's never referred to that way again. He's just Philip the Bastard. But he is basically this kind of wry, ironic presence. He's in many ways central to the play, and he ends up brokering a number of sort of unstable pieces between King Philip and King John. So he's on the scene. So here's an encounter between King Philip and King John outside of Angiers, where much of Act 2 takes place. Philip says, "Peace be to England. If that war return from France to England, there to live in peace. England we love, and for that England's sake, with burden of our armor here we sweat. This toil of ours should be a work of thine, but thou from loving England art so far that thou hast underwrought his lawful king, cut off the sequence of posterity, outfaced infant state, and done a rape upon the maiden virtue of the crown. Look here upon thy brother Joffrey's face," and he's indicating Arthur here, right? Arthur, the son of his brother Joffrey. "Those eyes, these brows were molded out of his. This little abstract doth contain that large which died in Joffrey, and the hand of time shall draw this brief into as huge a volume. That Joffrey was thy elder brother born, and this his son. England was Joffrey's right, and this is Joffrey's. In the name of God, how comes it then that thou art called a king, when living blood doth in these temples beat, which owe the crown that thou o'ermasterest? King John responds, from whom hast thou this great commission, France, to draw my answer from thy articles? King Philip says, from that supernal judge that stirs good thoughts in any breast of strong authority, to look into the blots and stains of right. That judge hath made me guardian to this boy, under whose warrant I impeach thy wrong, and by whose help I mean to chastise it. So this is, I mean, obviously a dire existential crisis between these two, and is backed up, right, by Eleanor and Constance, remember, whom we'll meet in a second more fully. But there's one more encounter that I want to just briefly touch on here in Act 2, Scene 1, and that is this encounter between King John and a citizen of Angiers, which kind of plays up this idea that actually the individual citizens are not sort of divinely inspired to swear their allegiance to one king or another. They're basically carried along on these tides of history. And so Shakespeare is asking, right, is our English history really this fated thing of these great monarchs, or is it these sort of bumbling buffoons wearing crowns? So here's King John says, France, hast thou yet more blood to cast away? Say, shall the current of our right roam on, whose passage, vexed with thy impediment, shall leave his native channel, and or swell with course disturbed even thy confining shores, unless thou let his silver water keep a peaceful progress to the ocean? King Philip says, England, thou hast not saved one drop of blood in this hot trial more than we of France, rather lost more. And by this hand I swear that sways the earth this climate overlooks, before we will lay down our just-born arms, we'll put thee down, 'gainst whom these arms we bear, or add a royal number to the dead, gracing the scroll that tells of this war's loss, with slaughter coupled to the name of kings. Now this is two kings, right, ready to kill each other and come to blows over fighting that has as yet been inconclusive over the stronghold of Angiers, right? The bastard, remember Philip the bastard, says in an aside, ha, majesty, how high thy glory towers when the rich blood of kings is set on fire. Oh, now doth death line his dead chaps with steel. The swords of soldiers are his teeth, his fangs, and now he feasts, mousing the flesh of men in undetermined differences of kings. Why stand these royal fronts amazed thus? Cry havoc, kings, back to the stained field, you equal potence, fiery kindled spirits, then let confusion of one part confirm the other's peace. Till then, blows, blood, and death. So Bastard is basically saying this is this conflict for which, you know, untold numbers of men, innocent men, will die. And it's basically just to sort of sort out this issue. It's going to be the right of whoever wins, and that's that. So King John says, whose party do the townsmen yet admit? Speak, citizens, for England, who's your king? This is Philip says. And then a citizen comes out, the king of England, when we know the king. So he's saying, we swear allegiance to the king, right? The king is this figure, this sort of abstract figure that hovers above this all, and whoever is going to come out on top, that's who we'll swear allegiance to. King Philip, know him in us, that here hold up his right. And then King John, know in us, that are our own great deputy, and bear possession of our person here, lord of our presence, Angiers, and of you. The citizen says, a greater power than we denies all this, and till it be undoubted, we do lock our former scruple in our strong barred gates, kings of our fear until our fears resolved, be by some certain king purged and disposed. Then the bastard says, by heaven, these scroils of Angiers flout you, kings, and stand securely on their battlements as in a theatre, whence they gape and point at your industrious scenes and acts of death. A wonderful moment of irony there, right? That this is, in fact, playing out in a theater, and we are sitting here comfortably thinking, well, which one has a claim to the crown? But ultimately, right, the only sort of security is God, who is very, very indeterminate here, right? We don't know which one God wants to be king, and it's just going to be, well, whoever wins, that's going to turn out to be the right thing, right? And this is the funny thing about monarchy that Shakespeare's pointing out, right, is that you do have a kind of predetermined circular argument that whoever is king, that's who God intends to be king, but at the same time, you have to construct out of it some sense that, well, this was meant to be, or this was good, right? Or that the line is uninterrupted. And so he set up for himself this problem that he has to work out, right? Your royal presences be ruled by me. Do like the mutines of Jerusalem, be friends a while, and both conjointly bend your sharpest deeds of malice on this town. By east and west let France and England mount their battering cannon charged to the mouths, till their soul-fearing clamours have brawled down their flinty ribs of this contemptuous city. I'd play incessantly upon these jades, even till unfenced desolation, leave them as naked as the vulgar air. That done, dissever your united strengths, and part your mingled colours once again, turn face to face and bloody point to point. Then in a moment Fortune shall cull forth out of one side her happy minion, to whom in favour she shall give the day, and kiss him with a glorious victory. How like you this wild counsel, mighty states? Smacks it not something of the policy? King John, now by the sky that hangs above our heads, I like it well. France, shall we knit our powers and lay this Angiers even with the ground? Then after fight, who shall be king of it? Bastard to King Philip, and if thou hast the mettle of a king, being wronged as we are by this peevish town, turn thou the mouth of thy artillery, as we will ours, against these saucy walls, and when that we have dashed them to the ground, why then defy each other and pell-mell make work upon ourselves for heaven or hell? King Philip, let it be so. So it's sort of tragicomic, right? It's these sort of skeevy citizens aren't declaring for one side or another. And so the bastard finds a way to unite the two kings against Angiers. And then after that, they're going to return right back to fighting again. Let me tell you something really important about ExpressVPN. We all do stuff on the internet that we don't want other people knowing about, especially in this day and age when the classics are getting canceled, right? You don't want people to know that you're searching for forbidden books like Boethius and Plato. but seriously, right? I mean, you might, for example, let's say you want to protect your family, you want to search for firearms on the internet. You don't want people to know. Even when I'm at home, I never go online without using ExpressVPN. And it doesn't matter if you get your internet from Verizon, from Comcast, from Spectrum, whatever. ISPs in the US can legally sell your information to ad companies, no matter which kind of service you are using. So ExpressVPN is an app that reroutes your internet connection through their secure servers so your ISP can't see the sites you visit. It keeps all your information secure, encrypts 100% of your data with the most powerful encryption available. And it's so easy, truly. I mean, you do not have to be an expert. I barely even notice I have it on most of the time. It runs seamlessly in the background. You can protect your online activity today with the VPN rated #1 by CNET and Wired. Visit my exclusive link, expressvpn.com/heretics, and get 3 extra months for free on a 1-year package. That's expressvpn.com/heretics, expressvpn.com/heretics to learn more. So, up to this point, we are basically in the year 1200. Remember I said that King John takes the crown at 1199. In 1200, this conflict did come to a head. There was a treaty, the Treaty of Le Goulet, in which Philip basically abandoned Arthur and recognized John. And this was a major event, but it was kind of short-lived. And it was a shaky peace to begin with. This is an inherently unstable situation, right? That the King of France is ruling over kings of England and has a vested interest in deciding which one is going to rule. We sort of fast forward, again, Shakespeare compresses the history, but we sort of fast forward to 1202 to 4, at which point war breaks out again, and now the Pope gets involved. And so in the play, the Pope sends his legate Pandulf, who has a number of grievances with John. One is that he's not acknowledging the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, whom we've met already because he's eventually going to deal with Magna Carta in 1215, but we're still back in 1204. Eventually, Pandulf breaks up this alliance between Philip and John, and they are back to fighting. So here's a little excerpt from Holinshed again to bring us up to speed. In the year 1202, King John held his Christmas at Argenton in Normandy, and in the Lent following, he and the French king met together near unto the castle of Guiton, and there in talk had between them he commanded King John with no small arrogancy, and contrary to his former promise, to restore unto his nephew Arthur, Duke of Britain, all those lands now in his possession on that side the sea. So this is basically war breaking out again, an affront from King Philip to King John, which King John earnestly denied to do, whereupon the French king immediately after began war against him, and took Buchan, Ogy, and the castle of Linus. Moreover, he besieged the castle of Radpont for the space of 8 days, till King John came thither, and forced him to depart with much dishonor. Howbeit, after this, the French king one gurney, and then returning to Paris, he appointed certain persons to have the government of the foresaid Arthur, Duke of Britain, and then sent him forth with 200 men of arms into Poitou, that he might bring the country also under his subjection. So basically, Philip has captured the castle, captured a number of castles, and especially Mirabeau Castle in France, starting to win back this territory, claim it for Arthur. John returns then and surprises him at what's called the Battle of Mirabeau, and wins and captures Arthur. And so this is the event that will precipitate what happens next in the play, that Arthur comes under the custody of King John. The French king and the nobles of France declare that they will hold no peace as long as Arthur lives. And so, we read in Holinshed, King John, through persuasion of his counselors, appointed certain persons to go unto Falaise, where Arthur was kept in prison under the charge of Hubert de Burgh, and there to put out the young gentleman's eyes. And so, this is the crux of a very strange series of events in King John, where we have to jump around a little bit, because what happens essentially is that King John gives the order for Arthur to be killed, and to have his eyes put out, as we have in Holinshed, but also to be killed. And then there's this encounter between Hubert and Arthur, where Arthur is made even younger than in fact he was. But this doesn't come until Act 4. And before that, we have the rumor out abroad, and this is true in Holinshed too, we have the rumor out abroad that Arthur is dead. And so we have the mourning, the grief of Arthur, before we have the actual murder. And even then, Hubert can't do the murder. I'm going to start with Act 4, and this is the place and time when Hubert fails to kill Arthur and instead spirits him away, but lets the rumor be spread that he's killed. And then I'm going to go back to Act 3 and talk about the grief of Constance over what she thinks is the death of Arthur, even though it's not the death of Arthur yet. So Hubert is here with some executioners, and Arthur pleads with Hubert. He says, "Oh, save me, Hubert, save me. My eyes are out, even with the fierce looks of these bloody men. Hubert, give me the iron, I say, and bind him here." Arthur, "Alas, what need you be so boisterous rough? I will not struggle, I will stand stone still. For God's sake, Hubert, let me not be bound. Nay, hear me, Hubert, drive these men away, and I will sit as quiet as a lamb. I will not stir nor wince, nor speak a word, nor look upon the iron angrily. Thrust but these men away, and I'll forgive you, whatever torment you do put me to." And Hubert says to the executioners, "Go stand within, let me alone with him." Arthur says to Hubert, "Alas, I then have chid away my friend. He hath a stern look, but a gentle heart. Let him come back," this is the executioner, "that his compassion may give life to yours." Hubert says, "Come, boy, prepare yourself." Arthur, "Is there no remedy?" Hubert, "None but to lose your eyes." Arthur, "O God, that there were but a mote in yours, a grain, a dust, a gnat, a wandering hair, any annoyance in that precious sense. Then, feeling what small things are boisterous there, your vile intent must needs seem horrible." This is obviously a reference to take the mote out of your own eye, right? He's appealing to his Christian charity. Hubert, "Is this your promise? Go, hold your tongue." Arthur, "Hubert, the utterance of a brace of tongues must needs want pleading for a pair of eyes. Let me not hold my tongue. Let me not, Hubert. Or, Hubert, if you will, cut out my tongue, so I may keep mine eyes. Oh, spare mine eyes, though to no use, but still to look on you. Lo, by my troth, the instrument is cold, and would not harm me. Hubert, I can heat it, boy." "No, in good sooth," says Arthur, "the fire is dead with grief, being create for comfort, to be used in undeserved extremes. See else yourself, there is no malice in this burning coal. The breath of heaven hath blown his spirit out, and strewed repentant ashes on his head." Now, this goes on for a while, but eventually Hubert simply doesn't have the heart. He spirits him away, he pretends he's done the deed, lets the rumor go out abroad. But what's fascinating about the Shakespearean play is that already the play has been proceeding as if Arthur is dead, which is eventually what happens. Arthur does die, and we're going to get to Arthur's death in a minute. But Shakespeare is basically, I think, showing you these two things at once, that history does have a kind of course that marches on and that we can't totally escape. But at the same time, the bumbling people within it, right, do make differences in the way that course flows. And so God ultimately is, I believe, the author of this story here. He's telling the story about how the dynastic succession passed from Richard on to John, and then after John's death down the line from there. But what he's also doing is he's showing that, like, in the context of that divine plan, it's not as if the people themselves have some, grand vision or know where things are going. They're kind of fumbling and bumbling along as God guides things along. in the process writing one of the most sublime speeches in all of Shakespeare. I mean, this is not known, King John is not known as one of the greatest Shakespeare plays, but this speech is, again, part of why it's dated to 1596 and is also just a remarkable. Constance comes out with her hair unbound and mourns the death of her son before he's died. Going back then to Act 3, Scene 4, they accuse Constance of being mad because her hair is unbound and she's in utter madness and sorrow. They accuse her basically of being mad because she's in such grief, but Constance says, "I am not mad. The hair I tear is mine. My name is Constance. I was Joffrey's wife. Young Arthur is my son, and he is lost. I am not mad. I would to heaven I were, for then 'tis like I should forget myself. Oh, if I could, what grief I should forget. Preach some philosophy to make me mad, and thou shalt be canonized, Cardinal." She's talking to Pandulph. "For being not mad, but sensible of grief, my reasonable part produces reason. How I may be delivered of these woes, and teaches me to kill or hang myself. If I were mad, I should forget my son, or madly think a babe of clouts were he. I am not mad. Too well I feel the different plague of each calamity." And she goes on, and then King Philip says, "You are as fond of grief as of your child." Constance says, "Grief fills the room up of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, puts on his pretty looks, repeats his words, remembers me of all his gracious parts, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form. Then have I reason to be fond of grief. Fare you well. Had you such a loss as I could give better comfort than you do." It's an amazing speech. And again, it happens basically as if the fate of the history is traveling on, even as the play itself is more stumbling and complex. And so basically the answer to the question that I asked at first, right, is it fate or history that drives us on, or do we have the individual choice to act? The answer is both, right? We both have enormous impact over the people in our lives, our parents, our relationships, right? And in some cases, if we find ourselves by God ordained in a certain position, we have the power to change the course of events, but at the same time, there is a providence that watches over all, and we operate within the context of that providence, which does circle us about. And so ultimately, right, and part of this, the genius of this, right, is that because it's a history play, there is a history that has to play itself out, even though Shakespeare can choose how that is expressed and portrayed, right? And so ultimately, we do have the death of Arthur. And what's so interesting is that even in the history, it's quite uncertain how Arthur died. Remember that when we last left him, Hubert had spared his life because he was just too sweet and wholesome. And Holinshed records, "Now touching the manner in very deed of the end of this Arthur, writers make sundry reports. Nevertheless, certain it is that in the year next ensuing he was removed from Falais unto the castle or tower of Rouen, out of which there was not any that would confess that he ever saw him go alive." So he never left Rouen alive. Some have written that he essayed to have escaped out of prison, and proving to climb over the walls of the castle, he fell into the river of Seine and so was drowned. That's basically going to be what happens in Shakespeare. Others write that through very grief and languor, he pined away and died of natural sickness. But some affirm that King John secretly caused him to be murdered and made away, so as it is not thoroughly agreed upon in what sort he finished his days. And that's even, that order of murder from King John and the order of having his eyes poked out, which we got earlier, is basically conflated in Shakespeare because the confusion of the historical report is reflected here. Eventually, what happens in Shakespeare is that Arthur tries to escape in disguise, ends up on the wall, and falls to his death. And so it's gruesome and sort of tragicomic. And Hubert, ironically, comes at that very moment to announce that, in fact, he hasn't killed Arthur and Arthur is alive. So this is Act 4, Scene 3. And Hubert has said, "I didn't kill Arthur." And then the bastard has had to say, "Well, but Arthur is, in fact, dead anyway." "If thou didst but consent," he says to Hubert, "to this most cruel act, do but despair. And if thou want'st a cord, the smallest thread that ever spider twisted from her womb will serve to strangle thee. A rush will be a beam to hang thee on. Or wouldst thou drown thyself? Put but a little water in a spoon, and it shall be as all the ocean, enough to stifle such a villain up. I do suspect thee very grievously." And Hubert says, "If I in act, consent, or sin of thought be guilty of the stealing that sweet breath, which was embounded in this beauteous clay, let hell want pains enough to torture me. I left him well. The bastard says, "Go, bear him in thine arms. I am amazed, methinks, and lose my way among the thorns and dangers of this world." So the bastard is really in some ways, he's almost like a chorus in that he sort of sees into the heart of things, and comments for us upon just the strangeness of how these things play out and the tragedy of the deaths that have to happen in the unfolding of history. These things are such mysteries for us, right? Because ultimately we can't stand outside and see God's view, see how these things are all going to play out. We just are basically tossed around by fate. And Bastard goes on, "How easy dost thou take all England up from forth this morsel of dead royalty, the life, the right, and truth of all this realm is fled to heaven, and England now is left to tug and scramble, and to part by the teeth the unowed interest of proud swelling state. Now for the bare-picked bone of majesty doth dogged war bristle his angry crest, and snarleth in the gentle eyes of peace. Now powers from home and discontents at home meet in one line, and vast confusion waits, as doth a raven on a sick fallen beast, the imminent decay of rested pomp. Now happy he whose cloak and cincture can hold out this tempest. Bear away that child, and follow me with speed. I'll to the king. 1,000 businesses are brief in hand, and heaven itself doth frown upon the land." So he's talking, Shakespeare is talking about a period in English history that is remembered as dark, is the loss of this territory, and the failure of the Angevin dynasty. And he's dramatizing this as basically a kind of divine mystery, that the way people interact and personally and their characters interact, which is dramatized perfectly on stage, is nevertheless carried along on this course, this stream of history. It's very powerful. Again, we compress the history a little bit. And so John in reality died of dysentery, but it wasn't for many, many years. Here, John dies sort of randomly in the play. It's almost an anticlimax after we've had this dramatic situation with Arthur. He dies of a fever. He's poisoned by a monk who's basically introduced for this purpose. And so we pass allegiance on the bastard, and a number of others pass allegiance onto John's son, Henry, who will then become Henry III. And this final speech that he makes is really a kind of button, a comment on the whole thing. This is obviously Act 5, Scene 7. He says, "Oh, let us pay the time, but needful woe, since it hath been beforehand with our griefs. This England never did, or never shall, lie at the proud foot of a conqueror, but when it first did help to wound itself. Now these her princes are come home again, come the 3 corners of the world in arms, and we shall shock them. Naught shall make us rue, if England to itself do rest but true." He's saying now that this internal strife between the different potential monarchs, Arthur and John, is put to rest, now there will be peace in England. And the history of England, the subsequent history of England doesn't quite bear that out, but it's an interesting comment that has been made of America too, that she can never fall unless she turns inward against herself. But this is a strange and difficult play because in fact, right, King John is this dark period in English history. And yet the monarchy itself, right, which is this abstract thing. Remember the citizens of Angiers swearing allegiance abstractly to the monarchy, even when they don't know who the king is going to be, right? We're going to be faithful to the king. And they're going to let basically the course of history decide this. We ourselves are in a similar period, I think, in which we feel swept along by history, right? And the faith that we have, those of us who have faith, is that there is something greater being worked out. That's what I think Shakespeare ultimately looks on the monarchy as, right? Is the greater thing, even in dark times, even in fumbling and weird times, there is this continuity that is the nation and the kingdom, and that is an idea that's very powerful in English history. It can be very powerful for us in our history, if indeed we will pay any attention to it. That's why we do this show. Thanks for walking with us through King John. Let's do the mailbag. Guys, I'm really excited to let you know about this deal that we have going on all through the month of July. If you sign up for an annual VIP membership on Locals in the Young Heretics community, you will get a free We're Reading Homer and Screw You shirt. I love this shirt. It's so funny, and it's one of our most popular. You get it for free if you go over to Locals. And you know about Locals. It's this amazing place where we can be free of the threat of big tech. You get episodes a week in advance advance if you're a VIP, and you get all sorts of exclusive benefits, like articles that we discuss together as you go more deeply into the ideas on this show. It's an awesome place to be. If you are either a monthly member or not a member at all, you can go now to youngheretics.com/locals during the month of July, sign up for an annual membership, screenshot your receipt, and send it to me at promo@youngheretics.com. The first 50 people who do that will get a free We're Reading Homer and Screw You shirt. And everybody, whoever does it, will get all the awesome benefits of being a VIP. So I would love to see you there. Okay, so mailbag questions come to me exclusively from Locals VIPs. So if you have burning questions that you want to ask me, you must become a VIP. Here is a mailbag question from Young Heretics VIP Abram, or Abram, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. If Jesus Christ was physically alive today, preaching the same as he preached around 2,000 years ago, would he have chosen a political and economic system, if any at all? I've seen many on the web toy around with this somewhat silly idea, with some claiming he would have been a communist/socialist. Thoughts on this idea? Okay. Well, the communism thing is just silly. It comes from a number of things. It comes from, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Jesus does have a detachment from money. He believes that the image that is on you, which is the image of God, is infinitely more important than the image which is on the coin, which is the image of Caesar. He believes, money belongs to the power of the world. You deal with it in that way. Ultimately, it's going to pass away like all the things of this world. But at the same time, right, he does use financial metaphors all the time. The parable of the talents is a great example, right? You have to invest your talents and your time just like you invest your treasure. And so this idea kind of that Jesus would have been a communist socialist comes out of that. It also comes out of the fact that the early church seems to have pooled its resources, shared things in common. We get this in Acts. Now, the grand irony of all this, right, is if you had to formulate a response to this, well, look, right, the only reason it mattered at all that the church shared things in common, that they were able to give things to one another, is because they lived in a society that was not communist, that is, that didn't force them by law to share things with one another. So it's only remarkable in Acts that they do that precisely because the context within which they live gives meaning to that action. That is why communism and socialism at base is such a bad idea. It destroys that possibility. It destroys the possibility of charity. Now, Jesus' kingdom was not of this world. He says that very explicitly. It can be hard for people like me who care a lot about politics to deal with this. But if it had been of this world, right, he would not have been crucified. And so it's not that I don't think that Christians can bring their faith to politics. I do believe that they can. I believe that the principles of the gospel dictate certain actions and not others. And that, for example, racism, that is actual racism, that is things like Jim Crow or slavery, or now if we try to enshrine the woke racialist creeds into law, all of those things, right, are anti-gospel, and Christians have an obligation to vote against it, to work against it. But we live in a very rarefied and specific time in history when we have that kind of input, and our Christianity cannot be essential to that input. And the reason for that is that the world is a broken place, and as I've talked about before, any moment, right, that freedom can be snatched away. And so I believe that one of the most important things about Jesus' life and ministry is that it was untouchable by the random chance that we've been talking about in this episode, right? The king is battling with the king of France, and who's going to inherit the throne or whatever, and everything is dependent on that in the world, right? All your life, all your treasure, all of that, all your physical life, whatever. The gospel cannot be touched by that because the gospel is true in all times and places. And so that's one reason why, even if Jesus would have had ideas about politics, even if he would have had the best ideas about politics, everyone says so, even if that's true, right? He, I believe, would have refrained from outlining a political system because he knew that your salvation, your love, your divine fate could not be dependent upon this broken world and the powers within it. That's also why I think we get instructions in the New Testament to submit to those powers, because those powers are not determinative ultimately of our salvation. He didn't want to make them determinative of our salvation, and Jesus' kingdom, remember, again, is of an entirely different order. You can find salvation under communism just as you can find salvation under capitalism, but your life might be better under capitalism. I hope that answers your question. One last note is that the people who say Jesus was a communist or a socialist, almost always have never actually cracked a Bible and are just trying to use your Christianity against you. There are so many people out there who don't believe in Jesus, who don't believe in God, and yet want to hold you accountable for what they believe your Christianity should mean. Well, it should mean that you care about Black Lives Matter. Well, it should mean that you do X, Y, Z. You call yourself a Christian, blah, blah, blah. There's a great article by P.G. Keenan called You Call Yourself a Christian. And it's about this, right? You're not beholden to those people. You are beholden to the church and to God. And those directives, that gospel will teach you how to follow Jesus in your time and place, not some troll on Twitter. Thanks for the question, Abram. It's been really great having you in the community. Welcome. Thanks for being a VIP. If you're not yet a VIP, go to youngheretics.com/locals, and you can join us in the search for deeper meaning. Thanks also for listening. Wherever you get your podcasts, if you haven't already, please subscribe, let people know. Leave a 5-star review, share this message. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute, which is where I work. We put out 2 publications, the Claremont Review books and the American Mind, both, in my humble opinion, excellent. And I'm not just saying that because I edit both of them. I am an editor on the team of both of them. If you'd like to support our work recovering the American ideal, go to claremont.org/donate. Mention in the note that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics. It is such a joy always to be with you, to be sharing this classical education with you. I will see you again next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.